spelled a bit of a peculiar way, I think. But
Yep.
just look up Hayek and free market monetary system and look at that paper. And,
Yeah.
and if you read it with a critical mind, not just because we're critical, but because we never understand anything unless we get it right. So you don't just say accept what someone says. You say, okay, he's saying that private money would solve all these problems of government money. But the fact is, what he's saying is government money is the very private money that he's advocating. Moreover, he's not offering a single reasonable, there isn't even an attempt to offer any qualification of this at all. It's mere assertions, It's nothing but a bunch of crap, In fact, the guy is so obviously so mistaken, although he's supposedly a leading advocate of Austrian economics, he's totally confused on what is federal and private money. But here's the further
So is he saying that Federal Reserve
yes
money is government money?
yes
Okay.
yes read the paper, you'll see. And now that I've mentioned that, you'll notice it, and you'll see, your jaw will drop down. You'll be aghast reading the whole thing. I mean, how could you more certainly invalidate your very own preposterous assertions, but by confusing that the money that he's referring to as flawed is federal, when in fact it's the very money that he's advocating, and then advocating that by privatizing it, you're somehow going to solve that, when the fact that it's private already is the reason it has the problems that it has.
Yeah.
I mean, you could.
Yes, his arguments are more relevant to the UK than.
No, his arguments are not relevant at all because they're based on totally wrong assertions. You can't claim that private money is going to fix the faults of federal money when what you're saying are the faults of federal money are the same faults of private money, which is issued by the same principles that you're advocating.
Yeah, which I completely agree with, and that's why I get the massive criticism from the free marketeers and the capitalists.
Well, those people, their days are numbered, and they know it, and that's why they become critical of anyone who can shoot holes in their work. They have argued for 20 years against me, saying that you can't use math to solve monetary issues. You can't solve math. You can't use math to identify problems. You can't use math to prove problems. You can't use math to model problems. I mean, the models that I provided, in 1982, the Reagan administration called me. I provided mathematic proofs that the things that he advocated to be as much as solution had no power whatever to accomplish their objects, that it was mathematically impossible that they did so. For instance, he advocated that reducing federal taxes 10% per year for 3 years was going to balance the federal budget and eliminate price inflation. I wrote him in my original propositions. I actually called the Reagan campaign and offered all these things, and they insisted that I send them. Yeah. So he was actually apprised of all these things in 1979, long before, in the debates between the eventual Republican and Democrat nominees, in which he turned to Carter and pronounced the $150 billion of federal debt that Carter had accumulated in 4 years.
Does he understand that is the money supply?
Pardon me?
Does he understand that is a massive chunk of our money supply?
Well, $150 billion of federal debt over 4 years, amounts to $37.5 billion a year of federal deficits. I mean, wouldn't we love to reduce the federal deficits to that now? Now, federal deficits don't accumulate in the same way that the sum of indebtedness does. But because the private or total sum of debt increases as it does as a consequence of the obfuscation of the promissory obligation, thus this leaves ever less to sustain federal costs. It also leaves us ever less creditworthy to sustain a vital circulation by borrowing ever greater sums of periodic interest and principal we pay out of a circulation back as new debts, increasing the debt at an ever escalating rate. So I actually defined all these methods of artificial sustention, is what I call them in whole, which included federal overspending would have to be resorted to in order to maintain a vital circulation, and that this would increase the federal deficits more than any predecessor before him, because the debt was increasing at a phenomenal rate. We had like 14% prime rates that is charged by the Federal Reserve to subservient banks when Reagan took office in 1980. All right. So I told him, 7 months before he was elected or something, I provided conclusive papers which proved that, number one, in regard to price inflation, prices were increasing about 14% per year. All right. The costs of supporting federal government, which we pay in taxes, are less than the total cost of all things, which are increasing 14% per year. Therefore, to increase a lesser thing, 10%, can certainly not account for the increasing whole increasing at an even greater rate. You see, it's mathematically impossible. You have a finite circulation, you have finite volumes which are changing in a finite, definite pattern, and there's no way that decreasing federal taxes 10% a year could even offset price inflation, you see. So that disproves the proposition of eliminating price inflation by reducing federal taxes, excuse me, 10%. Now, the other thing is, no more. Furthermore, this would not. Neither would it balance the federal budget, because the costs of federal expenses are going up likewise, so that's going to increase them on its own a minuscule amount. Meanwhile, as the cost of all things is increasing so much that we can't afford to service this accumulating sum of federal debt, therefore it's increasing by its rates of interest as well, while out of the whole volume of circulation, we can dedicate ever less to sustaining federal government, which means that the federal government can only sustain itself by borrowing ever further. And so and there's a need also which exists to sustain a vital circulation by the same federal overspending. And I explained that what the basic volumes are and how they interact, and that this would result in the federal debt increasing during Reagan's presidency more than it had for any president before him in history. Likewise, the next president, should the so-called economy survive so long, would engender even further multiplication of debts for a continuance of the exact same processes, and sooner or later, sooner rather than later, under the extremely elevated rates of prime rates that the Fed was charging, excuse me, we would suffer that, potentially suffer that failure. I projected at the earliest probably about the middle of a second term should he be reelected. Well, that in fact came very true because, we had a huge stock market crash then. But about 1982, I hadn't heard from them for a couple of years after the election. About 1982, I got a phone call out of the blue, and it was his staff, and I was passed off to several different people. But they admitted that it looked like all of my projections were coming true, and it looked like my reasons were entirely valid. And we had extensive discussions, in the end of which they asked me a question which I personally thought to be practically despicable, despicably corrupt. Because the only thing that it seemed to imply was that they were so corrupt that if they could slide through this thing somehow their way, they were going to do it that way. But if there was a failure, they were going to have a plan B where they weren't committing to my proof of singular solution, but they would probably, being as the case is with every one of these politicians, their major contributor is the financial system, so-called. So I was anticipating, on the other hand, that they would probably, compromise or obfuscate, my proof of singular solution into something which preserved this lie of an economy for yet another lifespan. They were looking for how much time they had to come up with something else. They asked me if I thought it was possible to project this eventual point of failure in any necessarily accurate, useful degree. And
so it could be someone else's problem.
Pardon me?
Well, so it could be someone else's problem.
Right. And I answered back immediately because, of course, I'd thought about this for many years, and I knew exactly how I would go about it. In the case that I'm providing such a model to a presidential administration, of course, I need to be highly accountable for things they may or may not understand in my in my documentation of the means and potential accuracy of my methods and all that. So being accountable, required some care that I might not have taken if I was just, intending to, be generally accountable, So anyway, I explained to them that all this model had to do was to start from any beginning circulation and sum of debt and rates of interest, and apply whatever the rate of interest would be for the subsequent period of time of examination, and borrow back so much principal and interest as is necessary to maintain a circulation, further borrowing any further circulation by which the volume of circulation might be increased, furthermore decreasing the debt by any phenomena which might be to some extent negate this increasing of artificial indebtedness, such as bankruptcy, etc. So they said, how would you do that? And I said, well, you're going to have to tell me, given whatever conditions might prevail, what interest rates you or the Federal Reserve are going to subject us to, this process to. And that means that you're going to decide have to decide at the brink of failure how much you're going to